All right, I think it makes sense to get started. We still do have a number of individuals logging on here, but we do have a lot to cover today, so it makes sense to get started. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. On behalf of the Royal Embassy of Norway in Lisbon, Esgian, and Norwegian Offshore Wind, I'm delighted to welcome you to a webinar covering offshore wind and the Portuguese market. My name is Ryan Tolson. I'll be your host today. I lead the commercial partnerships at Esgian, a global market intelligence and data analysis firm for the global offshore wind industry. We have many speakers today and a lot of information to cover. We will have time for questions and answers, but to keep things running smoothly, we will wait till the very end of the webinar to address all the questions and answers. There is a Q&A feature at the top of the screen. Just type your questions in there. Depending on how many questions we have, we will do our very best to get to all of them. But Portugal has been quite ambitious when it comes to offshore wind. And thus far as a country, they've been very efficient. I'm optimistic, and what I hope is that Portugal can continue with its get done attitude while moving ahead at rapid speed. There can be very good collaboration between both Norway and Portugal, and a lot can be learned from one another. And I believe you'll find this hour beneficial as you listen to presenters from Norwegian Embassy in Lisbon, Esgian, Mainstream Renewable, Source Galileo, Odfjell Ocean Wind, Saga Subsea, and Norwegian Offshore Wind, in which they will discuss the opportunities of offshore wind in Portugal. And with that being said, I am very excited to hand it off to and introduce you to Tova Bruvik Vestberg, the Norwegian ambassador to Portugal, to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for this introduction, and thank you to everyone attending this webinar and for the interest in Portugal in the field of offshore wind. I'm also like to thank Norwegian Offshore Wind Cluster and Esgian for co-organizing this event, and to Malte Paul from Mainstream Renewable and the others that will share their experiences from the industry perspective. So, and as you said, why are we here? Portugal is an Atlantic nation with excellent conditions for exploring renewable sources of energy, and in particular offshore wind. And Portugal has been in the forefront of the development of floating offshore wind technologies, and has already set the ambitious goal, as you referred to have 10 gigawatt of installed capacity by 2030. There is a strong political commitment and will to reach this goal and to move the process forward as swiftly as possible. There is a working group in action, and by the end of May, we expect the terms of the tenders will be clarified, and the first auction will be held after the summer. We do not yet have the date, but still after the summer. The whole process creates interesting possibilities for Norwegian offshore wind industry, a process that the embassy is here to support as part of our work together with clusters, individual entities, businesses, and not to forget Innovation Norway and Nordweb, the whole thing making up then Team Norway. We have lately been happy to receive some of you here and working with several individual companies and businesses and clusters with the expressed interest in the Portuguese market, and we will continue to do so. In January, the embassy organized with Innovation Norway and Norwegian Offshore Cluster a delegation visit to Portugal that made it possible to have to meet with government representatives, administration, and industry. I'd like also to mention that the embassy, together with Innovation Norway, recently visited the ports of two of the main ports in Portugal, Sines and Aveiro, where we discussed with key officials some of the opportunities that the offshore wind process offers, and some potential bottlenecks that need to be overcome. We will continue to raise awareness about the Norwegian capacity and knowledge and experiences also by visits to Norway. So next week, one state secretary will visit Hywind Tampen and to get to understand more of the process going on there. We will have another state secretary visiting Nord Shipping in June, and we will have media attendance also in Bergen for the Hywind Tampen, but also at the floating wind days in Haugesund. So creating that closeness with Norwegian expertise is very important on our side. We look forward to working with you, continue working with you to assist you the best as we can, that allow you to enter into fruitful partnerships with the Portuguese actors, but also with creating revenues and good market here, but also in the home market. So I wish you all a good webinar, and this is really a great event to be attending. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. It is really, really great to hear your perspective on the offshore wind market in Portugal. So thank you very for your comments there. Next, we have Esgian, who will be our next presenter. As I alluded to in my introduction, I am leading the commercial partnerships at Esgian. Esgian is a market intelligence and data analysis company for the global offshore wind industry. What we try to do with our platform is provide transparency and clarity into what can be said sometimes as a chaotic global offshore wind industry and make sense of it. You know, who is bidding, who's partnering together, who's developing, where is it happening, when is it happening, and with what equipment and with what vessels. And what is so fascinating is that the presentation you're about to hear from two of our analysts, everything comes from our platform. That is where the analysis is derived from. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to Johan and Kasper, two of our offshore wind analysts at Esgian.
Thank you, Ryan, for the intro. We will now take a dive into the offshore wind market in Portugal, where we will give a brief overview of the country's past experience, the current status of offshore wind, and some of the latest updates. We will also look at some of the next steps towards an auction round, present the proposed sites for offshore wind, and look into the status of the supply chain in Portugal. First of all, a brief macro overview. There is a lot going on in the world of offshore wind these days, with many countries pressing forward to allocate capacities and project areas in order to reach their 2030 targets. This year alone, there may be allocated up to 34 gigawatt of project capacity, with the highest density of allocations set to happen in Europe, with 12 different countries with open or set to open rounds this year. There's also a number of new markets emerging around the globe, and among these we see Australia, India, and potentially even Uruguay and Colombia later this year. There's also some newcomers in Europe set to host their first offshore wind auction this year, including such as Finland, Lithuania, Spain, Norway, and of course Portugal. Both Norway and Portugal are aiming to host auction rounds towards the end of the year, with both potentially offering both fixed and floating projects. Both the rounds are also set to open in a year with a record-breaking number of auctions going on, issuing in an environment where developers will have a great opportunity to choose where they place their bids. We now zoom a bit in on Portugal. And if we look at the timeline for offshore wind in Portugal, the first operational offshore wind installation was introduced in 2012 with the Windfloat 1 project, a 2 megawatt project with a floating turbine. And in 2020, Portugal got an additional 3 turbines with a 25 megawatt Windfloat Atlantic installation owned by Ocean Winds, Repsol, and Principal Power. So as we can see, Portugal already has some experience with floating offshore wind installations. Then we fast forward to 2022. Portugal announced a new offshore wind specific targets, aiming to award 3 to 4 gigawatts in an upcoming auction round. This was followed by several new target hikes throughout last year, marking higher and higher ambitions from the government, with the current goal set at an ambitious 10 gigawatt of capacity to be installed within 2030. Although Portugal is planning to start allocating these capacities through an auction towards the end of the year, as mentioned, the exact dates have yet to be announced. However, an important milestone in the push for offshore wind was reached this January, with the publication of the proposed sites for offshore wind development. The report outlined 10 potential areas for the development of offshore wind, as shown on the map to the right, with the marked zones from 1 to 10, and with the zones stretching all along the west coast, profiting from favorable winds of the Atlantic Sea. Among the 10 potential areas, 7 were outlined as floating projects, 2 fixed projects, and 1 potentially expanded demo area. The total capacity outlined was just above 11 gigawatts, exceeding the targets for 2030. The projects vary a lot in size, with the majority of the large zones outlined in the north of the country. The smallest of the projects is the 53 megawatt fixed CNS port, marked as Area 10 on the map, and the largest being the 4 gigawatt Figueira da Foz, marked as 5 on the map. My colleague Johan will later go into the potential zones and what they can offer. For the offshore wind auction sets for the end of the year, there are some key issues that yet need to be clarified, several of which important to attract international developers in a competitive market. On the framework and policy side, the Portuguese government need to clarify which zones will be approved for offshore wind developments. In addition, they need to clarify if they intend to auction out both the fixed and floating projects in the same upcoming auction rounds. And on the auction round itself, the government has stated that it is working on the guidelines for the auction rounds, with key points of interest for developers being the timetable for the round and the allocation criteria that the government chooses to decide who wins the bids. Lastly, the government needs to clarify the level of subsidy, if any, that will be available for developers. This may be an important point for the round, given the number of auction rounds being hosted for floating projects this year, including in Norway and in UK, which both will offer CFD contracts for developers. Having said that, I give the word over to my colleague Johan, which will go into some of the current projects and the supply chain in Portugal.
Thank you for that, Casper. As we will see, Portugal already has some experience within offshore wind and has been a mover within floating wind in several instances. Windfloat 1 was the first project deployed in Portuguese waters. It consists of a 2 megawatt Vestas turbine and is based on the Windfloat technology developed by Principal Power. The project was the first to ever couple a floating wind turbine with a semi-submersible platform, something that has later been deployed several times globally. As you can see from the participant list, the project utilized the Portuguese supply chain with ASM Industries for the floating foundations and Solidale for the dynamic cable. The project was operational in 4 years before it was decommissioned in 2016 and later transported to the UK. It is now located south of Aberdeen, where it has been operational since October 2018 and is now part of the Kincardine project. The second offshore wind project in Portugal, the Windfloat Atlantic, was the first floating wind farms in continental Europe. The wind farm comprises 3 8-megawatt Vestas turbines and has been operational since 2020. The contracted companies for the project was very much the same as for Windfloat 1, but with some additions. Also, considering the complexity of larger capacity and several floating foundations, they had to rely on the Spanish supply chain. One of the floating foundations was supplied by the joint venture Navantia Windar and built on their shipyard in Fini. Cables was also outsourced for this project. The areas put forward in the preliminary proposal compromises a floating wind capacity of 10 gigawatts. The capacity density that has been applied when estimating the capacity for the individual sites is ranging between 3 and 4 megawatts per square kilometer. This is a general capacity density and commonly applied to scope out initial capacity from these areas. However, we have seen with the latest California auction and for some of the ScotWind projects that the initial scoping capacity density has been conservative and has later been projected closer to 4.5 megawatts per square kilometer. This table illustrates a scenario where we extend the potential of the sites by increasing the capacity density in line with the second-hand capacity from previous projects under development. Using this approach, we see that the total floating wind capacity of the sites increases by almost 4 gigawatts or 40%. Keep in mind that this is a theoretical capacity which will depend heavily on the geographical site specifications, floating technology preference, and floating technology preference. However, it does reflect that we might see more potential being taken out of the lease areas, which results in larger investments and requires more supply chain capacity. So, how is the current offshore wind supply chain looking in Portugal? Portugal has 4 factories which has been contracted for offshore wind projects. From the top of the map in this slide, we can see the location of Solidal's cable factory. Solidal has delivered dynamic cables for the Windfloat 1 project, but has besides that little to no experience within offshore wind. Lankhorst has a fairly large rope factory located in Maya. The factory has supplied both Windfloat Atlantic and Kincardine with the Gamma 98 Dyneema rope. Its location is also geographically convenient with the larger floating wind sites set to be developed. CS Wind currently has 2 factories in Portugal. The Korean company entered the Portuguese supply chain through the acquisition of ASM Industries. ASM has previously supplied floating foundations from its Linsnave facility for both Windfloat Atlantic and Windfloat 1. However, they might direct their focus exclusively on tower production, and this is more in line with CS Wind strategy. Looking at Portugal's 2030 target of 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, their supply chain is looking underdeveloped. Spain has a significantly lower 2030 target of 3 gigawatts, while also having a large developed supply chain. The location of the different factories can be seen on the slide. Having factories for a great variety of components for offshore wind, already being a key suppliers to several floating wind projects, while having a large shipyard capacity and a geographical location, it is likely that Portugal will be using the Spanish supply chain when developing their projects. Looking at the rest of Europe, there are some countries that we want to highlight as potential key suppliers to Portugal, based on their delivery capabilities and facility capacity. Both Siemens Gamesa and GE have factories for turbine components in France with substantial production capacity. For floating wind, France has several projects coming up in the next couple of years. Some of these projects are enabling large local steel manufacturers to reduce their floating foundations. Getting this experience early on and having a potential large throughput, they might act as exporters of these components. Netherlands has been delivering components to the maritime industry for decades. We see that companies such as Delma and Rijhoff are using the country's factories to deliver anchors and mooring line to the offshore wind industry. Netherlands also have a strong track record of delivering topside for substations in Europe. Germany has a substantial industry for steel manufacturing and industrial electronics components. The high offshore wind activity in the country has resulted in a strong supply chain for both local development and export. At Esgian, we have identified 130 different floating technologies, and a great part of these is of Norwegian origin. Additionally, Norway has developed a comprehensive offshore supply chain through decades of oil and gas operations. These services can in many cases be applied to offshore wind, especially in deeper waters, which have been proven through their leading floating wind portfolio. To summarize, we are eagerly waiting for the confirmation of the auction framework and details around timetable, allocation rules, and auction size. Considering the auction landscape for 2023, the developers will have several auctions lined up and the ability to be selective in which auctions to attend. However, we are also seeing that auctions are gaining a lot of interest. So we expect that a favorable framework in line or above expectations will gain a lot of traction and competitiveness. Governmental initiatives and regulations have made 2030 a benchmark year both for offshore wind and country targets and projected capacity. This means that yearly offshore wind deployment globally will be ramping up towards and beyond 2030. Portugal, with its ambitious 2030 target of 10 gigawatt, will also be participating in the global supply chain during this timeframe. However, lead times for turbines and other critical components is currently around 4 years, meaning that if Portugal continues to move in this fast pace, makes offshore wind development attractive in the country through framework, and utilize the European supply chain effectively, they should be able to have an installed capacity close to their ambition in 2030. That's it for me. Thank you for listening, and I'll give the word back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Kasper, for very insightful analysis on the offshore wind industry specific to Portugal. As you can see here, we do have LinkedIn and a mailing list QR code. We publish a monthly newsletter and a quarterly market update. So feel free to register for those. With that being said, I'm going to stop this presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Malta Paul, Senior Project Manager at Mainstream, and Carlotta Rarissimo, Offshore Wind Technical Development Manager at Mainstream. And you guys are on mute. Yep, there you go. Fantastic.
Yeah, so we just need one more second sharing the screen, but dear Ambassador Tove and Ryan, thank you very much for having us here. Great pleasure to say a few words and share some thoughts of industry experiences here with you. Johan and Kasper, a great job with your assessment, quite a lot of interesting insights. Ryan, please give me a sign if you can see our slides. Okay, very good. Let us then go through that. I want to start with a few words about Mainstream. Mainstream is a global active renewable energy developer. We are developing, constructing, and operating, and we are leading mainly in onshore wind and solar, for example, in Chile and South Africa. Mainstream is from Ireland. However, it is owned by the Aker Group, or by Aker Horizons specifically, nearly 60%. From Norway, and Mitsui from Japan, around 25%. We have an ownership in Principal Power together with Ocean Wind and Tokyo Gas. And I see Mainstream not only as a typical developer, I see Mainstream as part of the ARCA ecosystem, as a technology and equity developer. And let me just quickly show you on the left bottom the ARCA group of companies. So you have the ARCA ASA in top, and then three main pillars, I would say: the oil and gas exploration, ARCA BP, the EPCI contracting, ARCA Solutions, and our mother company, where all renewable activities are concentrated, and that is ARCA Horizons. And under ARCA Horizons, there are various portfolio companies. For example, for clean hydrogen, we are closely cooperating on various activities, offshore wind to hydrogen. We have ARCA carbon capture and storage. We have my company, our company, we are working in Mainstream, and we see Principal Power. On the right bottom, just very briefly, the ARCA ecosystem and how we intend to utilize and leverage that. So, for example, from ARCA Solution, you see fish farming in combination with offshore wind. You see subsurface substations. So if we talk now Portugal about deep water, the question is it better to place a substation on the soil, or is it better to have a floating substation? We can discuss that in the group. We see the Principal Power with more than 12 years floating offshore wind experience. Johan and Caspar mentioned that. We have a lot of digitalization in the group, Cognite and ACE, or the hydrogen experience. And just one reference project which we which we are developing together with Shell is in Norway, the Aukra project. And so we are transferring the knowledge. I don't want to double too much of the Portuguese status here. So yes, the 10 gigawatt, this is great to see that. That is straightforward. That is more than triple the capacity of Spain. And let me just directly now take the previous presentation and say a few words in that regard. So in the previous presentation, we have learned that eventually the average utilization of the 11 areas here is around 3 megawatt per square kilometer. And if you are taking the 4.5 megawatt per square kilometer, you will have more capacity, maybe 14 gigawatt, if I understood Caspar and Johan right. It's also possible that potential constraints which might come up, whether that is navy, fishery industry, or nature constraints are, let's say, there is a potential for shaping the area. So in both directions, either increasing the capacity or we are on the safe side and we'll see 10 gigawatts. So that is just one reflection to the previous presentation. I think to other points I will come on the next slide. What is on my status?
Sorry.
Just 1 second. Maybe something that I would like to underline here. So we need in Portugal now, as the next step, the maritime spatial plan. So the draft areas are released. There will be a consolidation coming. So there was a consolidation statements, but there will be a formal consolidation coming, and then the spatial plan release. I think this is an important law for us. And the working groups installed by the government and APREN is, for example, providing very good input into that, delivering a kind of a report which will be, like we have it in Spain, in our opinion, a roadmap that will be submitted to the government, to the respective ministry in May. And that, in our opinion, then will be transferred into an offshore law. And if we see the spatial plan and the offshore law And if we see that as announced, and that is important, then we will see next the auction, as Tove was mentioning, after the summer. This is what we strongly believe that can happen. We only need the spatial plan and the offshore law for that. The ports and the grid, and we will talk about that now, is seen as the critical infrastructure, and that is something that we see in many markets, the grids, the ports and the grid. Just a quick implementation. So Portugal is targeting for 10 gigawatt in 2030. We believe that that is possible. And if you are opening up a project timeline, and maybe this is not very sophisticated, specifically, for example, for a Viana de Castelo 1 gigawatt area, but this is, I think, a good approximation. I see the auction later this year, beginning next year. You will run your environmental impact assessments, the reports, the alignment with the authorities, geophys and geotechnical surveys, and then the EPCI life cycle up to procurement and final investment decision, a little bit ambitious. Main soil investigation eventually, further procurement activities, first steel cutting, onshore construction. It is under discussion who is responsible for the export route, onshore and offshore, and then installation, start of construction in 29, and commercial operation date by end of 2030. Yes, that is possible. We believe in that. Let's continue here then. I want to share some experiences on ports and on grid, as I mentioned. So in our opinion, there are 5 installation ports existent in Portugal, 5 potential installation ports. However, currently none of that is fully ready. And so I think we all know that port retrofitting needs time, planning time, eventually funding, notification. It is expensive. However, I think that all ports will be needed, all 5 ports. So it's a long coastline, and I think it is a good advice to not only talk about competition. I think it is quite good to bring all ports ahead. I think that the main impulse here needs to come from the Portuguese state, explicitly the Ministry of Infrastructure. And I think that the Minister of Infrastructure in Portugal is a very strong supporter of offshore wind, João Galamba. So I'm very optimistic that there will be movement and that will be understood as a critical enabler for offshore wind for the implementation. Further, I believe very strongly in synergies and cooperation, and I'm suggesting to make that part of the application phase. So whenever there is an auction, let's clarify the cooperation that's here, see that there is coexistence, that there is cooperation and synergies between the developers, and that there is a cross-country cooperation possible. Maybe it's possible to set some strategic directions, for example, hubs for specific cargo, so to say. But I think what is even more important is please don't make the projects too small. So we need a sufficient project size that gives the developers money to co-invest in things. So I'm talking about, for example, row ramps, not a complete port retrofitting, but co-investments. And this is only possible if we talk about a gigawatt or more and not 500, 300 megawatt. And I think it is very important that we have a sizable pipeline of projects. So 10 gigawatt, let's bring that into a row over several years. This is, in my opinion, here the main message. Again, to Caspar and Johan, you mentioned the necessity to import goods. I'm talking about the opportunity to export. So you have 10 gigawatt on the table here. If you are now setting the right signs, if you are ramping up the industry or the ports, what we are specifically talking about, then we will see export to Spain, to France, to neighboring countries, because they are facing the same difficulties. Yes, they have a lot of factories and shipyards. However, if Spain in a second step is gearing up to 10 gigawatt, I don't know whether that is the case, but let's assume that then we will have, I think, a good situation if we have enough ports in Portugal as well. So quickly on the grid, Ren is the TSO here. So my main point with the grid is let's please identify a reliable grid connection date. So eventually we do that with a split, a clear split, which I expect in the offshore law. Who is building the grid? Is it REN or is it the developer? Where exactly is the handover? Is it offshore? Is it onshore? Is it the substation? Is it a combined substation? But the most important point is make a clear and reliable and a guaranteed grid connection date. That is on my wish list here, and we will try to argue for that for sure. You're all invited to help here. Just two additional thoughts. Hydrogen is a potential white knight here, in my opinion, so as it can relieve the grid constraints. So, and the suggestion from my side would be, please make announcements of that offshore areas without a grid connection, but with a pipeline connection. And let's then build a little bit of offshore wind for hydrogen. And the last point, once again, the cross-country a topic. So it is, in my opinion, extremely important that the interconnectors from Portugal are reinforced. And what we see, for example, with Norway, I think this is a very clever move, is the energy partnership. For example, here with Germany, it's a Norwegian-German energy corporation. And I think this is a similarity potentially between Norway and Portugal. Portugal, once the export capacities are reinforced and strategic partners with high demands are identified and partnerships are agreed, Portugal will have the opportunity to export commodities. Okay, that's it. Maybe I was a little bit too long. Carlotta will continue here. And Ryan, you give us a signal if we are, I think, Carlotta, over to you.
Yep. So conscious of time, but we'll just make a bit of a further description here of the required aspects that we need to take into account when we build a wind farm in Portugal and other locations as well. So just to give a bit of an understanding as to why, for example, timelines are important, when we're unlocking the site conditions that we need in order to be able to build a project, some of the aspects that we need to take into the account in the timeline that Malte just showed you right now as well, and that listed some of these, is, for example, environmental impact assessment studies. In this case, we mentioned specifically, for example, the likes of bird surveys, who can take up to 2 years almost to be able to collect the necessary data for you to carry that out. We have to do ground condition assessments. That includes geophysical surveys to have a determined and specific bathymetry to topography, identify any infrastructure that we have on the site, and get geological information of also what's below the soil, so we can decide on what foundations we're going to use. Likewise, we need to do geotechnical surveys, which include interference with the seabed. That means sometimes remove bits of soil to actually see what's in the stratification and try to understand how it's going to react. And again, this is all part of the need that we have to do to be able to determine the engineering. And then that will then move on to the supply chain and everything we need to order and all the infrastructure we need to put in place to be able to deliver. So this is just an example of essentially what we need to be able to really progress with the site. And then also we've got mid-ocean conditions, which sometimes go through buoys that we put in the water and need to be sometimes there for over a year as well, to be able to capture data such as wind, wave, and tidal, and which will also then determine the design of a site. And as you can see already by the timelines that I've been saying, these can be considered, wouldn't say bottlenecks, but these are things that are quite time consuming. And when we speak about time in offshore wind and in Portugal and in its targets and other countries' targets as well, when we say you want to do this by 2030, you can see that the direct impact that certain challenges that come up to these aspects can then present themselves and have an impact on the overall country targets in the end. So I'm not going to go extensively through each of these, but some of the challenges include is that Portugal is obviously not the only country that is looking at offshore wind. Everybody is. And that is fantastic. But at the same time, you can see that there is a simultaneous and international demand for survey vessels, for example, that are not as some geotechnical surveys need to be drilling units on them. They're not as common as one could perhaps think. And certain supplies, such as flight air bores, can be an international demand as well, which means there can be shortages in the supply, especially if we're doing several places at once in one go. So that's together with local resources demand. So to do local surveys for the environmental impact assessment, it's great when you have a local team. So that will create demand, but may also create pressure for a country if you do that. The government resourcing will be under pressure as well, because they need to review all of this and authorize all of this. For countries that are new to this, and Portugal will be one of them because it's upcoming, having processes in place specifically for offshore wind will take some time to set up. And all of this will create further need for resources and time to get these done. But we also see opportunities here, and together with Malta's Tone, we see immediate opportunity for Portugal as well. And there's a lot of ways we can start to tackle this right now even. And early site identification and seeing Portugal move with this timeline and move quickly and being ambitious is great for us, because that allows us early desktop data collection. If we know where the sites are, we can at least start seeing what is already been looked at these sites. Maybe we can get information that we don't previously that can already help, determine some of the site conditions, choose what sites we can go for, and try to plan for that. And create synergies with other projects, such as mid-ocean data capture. Maybe we can explore that, where we can get mid-ocean for several sites in one go, for example, and that would put less pressure on the supply chain of these buoys, for example. Regulatory and consenting requirements mentioned before in the previous presentations, and this comes up quite a lot of the time, not only for Portugal, but other countries. But the most simplified and clear it is, the less we will be also, having to chase the government and the regulator for clarifications, and the quicker we can prepare for that. And the earlier clear it is, we can already prepare for the requirements that are needed for us to be able to apply for licenses and the likes. And even exemption policies that you see, for example, in the UK, where for smaller surveys, you can apply for an exemption that gives you a fast track in regards to obtaining licenses to do, for example, certain surveys. And I think the most important of the last one is also what we want to say next, which is use the lessons learned, use the developer experience and other countries' experience to be able to use those lessons learned and ensure that when we put processes in place, that they are the most efficient ones and the ones that went through already a significant review, and then allow us to have the best processes in place at the first attempt. And all of this are just examples of how we believe that this can be sort of speed up. And the speeding up is important because in the end, it's all about the targets that Portugal wants to set for itself and that we all want to see happen, essentially. Very briefly, and apologies for the time.
Carlotta, I'm going to have to cut you off here. I apologize.
Okay.
We do have a few other presenters in the short
Absolutely.
15 minutes we have left. But
Okay.
what I will do, I want to thank both you, Malta and Carlotta, for a knowledge-packed presentation. But with your permission, I will share the presentations to
absolutely.
all the
Ryan,
presenters.
it's anyhow the last slide, and please apologize for running over a bit. Only the last sentence. APREN and Forum Oceano are doing a great job, and we are looking forward to see you in Lisbon on the 24th of May. So thank you very much, and please apologize again.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. I thought that was a fantastic presentation, knowledge-packed, and I will share this with the group. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. And with that being said, thanks again. I would like to hand it over to Rui Abigail, Grid Manager at Source Galileo, and Kenneth Fossoy, Business Development Manager at Odfjell Ocean Wind. So you guys can take it from here.
Thank you very much, Owen. First of all, can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so I would like to take the opportunity to present Source Galileo and Offshore Ocean Wind. So it's a partnership that we have developed for a few years already. So Source Galileo is a developer with a lot of experience in the offshore, onshore, and several technologies, mainly wind, solar, and generation, and batteries. Apologies. Offshore is a technology developer with a lot of experience on offshore infrastructure, and they are already proving their skills and experience in the market. So I know that our time is limited, so I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. This is a clear portfolio of the currently offshore wind projects being developed by Source Galileo. As you can see, we have a presence in Norway, we have a presence in UK and Ireland, Spain, and also we are looking to Portugal. Why Portugal is so interesting for us? Portugal has been for years an example of success with the first project back in 2004 in Europe, which Portugal achieved the renewable target of 20% by 2010, which was a substantial achievement for the European countries. So what we have been looking currently is that Portugal once more is providing the regulatory and the framework necessary structures in order to enable these developments. One thing being a grid manager, I'm quite happy to see that the infrastructure in Portugal is extremely strong. There is a lot of interconnectors between Portugal and Spain, with perhaps a capacity up to 6 to 10 gigawatts of exporting capacity. The infrastructure is also very close to the shore, which is a big enabler for these developments. So from our point of view, we are extremely excited with the current position of Portugal and with the current framework put in place. Now, in relation to the technology of Shell, I'm going to pass on to my colleague Kenneth in order to develop and give a little bit more of detailed information. Kenneth, do you mind, please?
Sure. I think you can just move to the next slide.
No problem.
Yeah, so we work together with Source Galileo on a selected number of projects and have a long-term ambitions to become a leading developer of wind parks and also solutions within the floating offshore wind domain. However, what we see is that it's very, very important to get started early, and I think also some alluded to the pace here. And what we see is that there is opportunities to accelerate floating offshore wind and also to do some early phase learnings, and that can be done if you work towards oil and gas. And there's several reasons for that. There is a framework that is available. There's also a lot of these metocean and geotechnical data around these areas as they have already been impact assessed. And what we will do is that we are now in active dialogues in Norway and also UK to accelerate floating offshore wind by installing 3 to 5 15 megawatt floating offshore wind units that are using existing infrastructure on the Norwegian continental shelf and also potentially UK. And the possibility to do this is that there's also in Norway power from shore infrastructure where you actually normally would fetch power from shore, but the potential is to use those AC cables and to deliver power to shore. And what we believe is that in order to realize these projects where you have, say, 30 to 40 units that are going to be built towards 2030s, you need to have done these small-scale projects in order to demonstrate the solutions, but also to develop scalable assembly methods, because both design and assembly methods are closely linked, and we see that the current supply chain and also cost of floating wind is not at the levels where we are able to develop an industry. And we are impatient drillers, so we see that it's very important to get started earlier. So we will start with oil and gas to demonstrate the solutions, get a few projects in the water, and then we will also plan to work with Utsira Nord to also develop that one already with potential development of part of it in 2028, and then use these experience to gradually increase the sizes of the park. And the way to do this is to work, or to be in position to do this, is to work very actively with the supply chain. So we have worked quite extensively with Siemens Gamesa. We have a framework agreement with Siemens Gamesa that allows us to call off smaller volumes. And the reason why we're able to get the framework agreement on small volumes is that we have used our experience from the drilling industry, where we have developed a multi-locational harsh environment design. So we've taken all the metocean data of the North Sea and developed a design that can go to the Norwegian Sea, Barents Sea, West of Shetland, all the harshest environments. So that means that when we do all the work together with the turbine provider, when we do all the coupled analysis with tower and so forth, we are able to have a design that can be applied for different locations without any modifications. And then we also work very closely with DNV as a certification agency. And we are also now, in relation to the oil and gas projects we are doing, we are also now in active dialogue with ports and yards. So we have 30 yards and so on that we are now screening towards these projects. So again, we think it's very important to start with concrete projects, small scale, as a learning basis, a stepping stone for the bigger projects. Next, Rudy.
We have just about 30 seconds left here before we have to.
Oh, 30 seconds left. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But just the background where we come from is that we have been a part of the early days of floating drilling in Norway. We have a legacy. We've been part of the first drilling operations and the start of the oil and gas business in Norway, where we designed all the units that you can see above here, and been part of kind of operating in harsh environments with the drilling rigs. And then we combined this with the floating team that we bought back in 2020 with the Ocean Wind team, and that's a team that also was part of developing the sway solutions and also the Hywind Tampen spar and so on. So we have a combination of a floating expertise team from floating wind, and also from our drilling experience in harsh environments. And then we have a design that is developed for the 12 megawatt, the deep sea semi, but that one will probably not be built, as we saw that we needed to change design in order to cater for 15 megawatts. So we now developed the Deep Sea Star, that is the 15 megawatt unit that we plan to deploy already in 2026, and also then to scale up towards larger projects. If you take the next, Ruby. Yeah, so just to summarize our company, we are part of the Odfjell group. So we have Odfjell Drilling that operates the floating drilling units. We have Odfjell Technology that is a service company, and then we have Odfjell Ocean Wind that is a private company that is part of the wind business. And we basically do three things. We develop our own floating wind solutions and designs. We also do develop assembly methods, as we see that it's very important to link assembly and design, and we do all that development in-house. So that's part of the solution side. Then we also do project development. So we take equity participation in projects, and we typically involved early phase, and that's also projects we do together with with Source Galileo. So we mature Utsira Nord and we mature oil and gas projects to up to typically FID, and then we gradually reduce our exposure as we are not kind of the heavy capital component. And then we also.
Hey Kenneth, I'm
Yep.
sorry, but I'm going to have to cut it off here. We have one last. I'm going to have to hand it over to Einar. I want to thank both Rui and you, Kenneth, for your time and your presentation. Like I mentioned, I will share these slides with the rest and contact information as well. But lastly, we have Einar Toleksvik, CEO of Saga Subsea, board member of Norwegian Offshore Wind, and responsible for leading the Norwegian Offshore Wind Working Group for the Portuguese market to close it out. So I'd like to hand it over to you, Einar.
Thank you very much, Ryan. You can see my presentation, maybe?
Yes.
I can get on the side where I'm able to share everything. That would be good as well. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you for a very good set of presentations. This picture on the front is not my idea. As you can see, I've removed most of my head from the hair from my head and to under my nose since this time. I'm leading the work group for Portugal. So this is my contact information that Esgian will share after the webinar. Shortly, no, that didn't work. There's the logo page. Shortly about Norwegian Offshore Wind is that we have 370 members. It is Norway's largest industry cluster, actually. And with this, around 37 of these companies, close to 40 companies, are directly interested in attending the development in Portugal. And not only in Portugal, but I'll get back to that in my last slide. The thing is that in Norwegian Offshore Wind, we have a set of working groups, where one specifically is for the Portuguese and one for the Spanish market. As I said, around 40 of these the companies are specifically interested in the Portuguese market. It's the companies or a set of companies leading the working group. It's not the administration of the Norwegian Offshore Wind. They are working as a back office, as administration, and working with us to set up everything, basically. But it's the companies leading, and with the companies leading the working group, you get a very pinpointed and exact interest in working towards those market areas that we would like to aim for. As mentioned, we had the delegation trip. We had a trip to Portugal recently, and one of the focuses that we have had in the working group is to walk up a three-way path for collaboration or cooperation. Reason is the cooperation to this development of offshore wind is the key. And after the last trip to Portugal that we had, we have already signed a collaboration between the Met Center and Norwegian Offshore Wind towards WAVEC, which is a similar organization in Portugal. Why? Because we create a bridge of collaboration for the companies. We are aiming for cluster-to-cluster cooperations or cluster cooperations between test centers, local stakeholders, to have a dialogue with fishery, with birds organization, with everything that is within and needed for success for both countries. The three-way path is because we have Norwegian interests, or the meaning of the three-way path is that we have Norwegian companies, Norwegian interest, member of Norwegian Offshore Wind, that are interested to do business in Portugal, to invest in Portugal and export from Norway. We also, with these cooperations, especially between, for example, Met Center, Norwegian Offshore Wind and WAVEC, is that it opens for collaboration between companies that Portuguese companies also have an open door to the Norwegian market. So that's the two-way street. when Norwegian and Portuguese companies find each other as cooperative, joint investments, whatever, they are also very attractive, or maybe smaller companies can join forces to get larger and be attractive for international projects in France, in UK, or elsewhere. We see this collaboration method as very efficient, highly efficient, both for joining to establish supply chains for innovation, technology development, export, import, etc. It's highly efficient and it works. And with this, we have activities. The green ones, they are done for the Portuguese market. Currently, we are on the yellow one, the webinar, and the next one is floating wind days in Haugesund in Norway. We're currently crashing a bit with the APREN event in Portugal, but we are in dialogue with them, had several meetings hoping for them to join. But we have a Portuguese delegation, we have Portuguese stakeholders represented and coming for the floating wind days. We have set up a Portuguese house for presentation, and they are a part of the program on the floating wind days. A very important agenda for meeting and mingling, and there is a planned media attendance from Portugal to the event itself. That's for the floating wind days. And then our next planned visit to Lisbon, or to Portugal at least, is currently being planned for mid-September, and will be a delegation from Norway with companies going towards the Portuguese market and Lisbon. So to keep the timeline, Ryan and Esgian, I'll leave it with that, because this is the activities. These are the activities that we have planned. There might come more, and that is basically it from my side. So I'm ending with that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Einar. That was very informative. So thank you. We were to leave some time for Q&A, but we had so many fantastic speakers sharing their knowledge that we don't have much time. We're a little bit over. But like I mentioned previously, I will share everyone's presentation with their contact information, and we can reach out directly if there are specific questions that need to be answered. But with that being said, I would like to thank Tove and the Royal Embassy of Norway in Lisbon. I'd like to thank Esgian. I'd like to thank Mainstream, Source Galileo, Odfjell, and Saga Subsea and Norwegian Offshore Wind for a fantastic, in my opinion, knowledge-packed webinar. So I want to thank everyone for their time. And that is it. Take care, you guys.
And thank you to Esgian for organizing, or at least.
And to you, Einar, as well. Yes.
Bye then.